So thanks again to everyone for joining us for our third installment of the Summer Breakthrough Series. This week we're doing the IN Experience. My name is Kathy Joseph. I am the USPTO Programs Lead for Accenture, and we're happy to be back to chat with you all in this series where we've been bringing industry leaders, thought leaders, to have conversations with us around trends and technology and design innovations. We've tailored these speakers and topics to be specific to our federal clients and specifically USPTO. We're really excited to have with us today Tim Irvine, who leads our federal studio in DC as we drive innovation to simplify government services. He's come to the federal space after leading Accenture's design and innovation unit, Fjord, in North America for 6 years, and he is singularly focused on leading and serving teams that create smart, simple, and lovable experiences. So he'll be leading the presentation today. We also have with us Kathy Conrad, who leads our digital government for Accenture Federal Services. She works with agencies across government to improve experience for the people that they serve. She came to Accenture from the federal government, where she led the Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies at GSA. She also leads our work for the Partnership for Public Service on Customer Experience, and USPTO has been an active participant for the past several years in that forum. So without further ado, I'm gonna turn it over to Tim to do the presentation. But we welcome you to post questions and comments into the chat. Tim's gonna speak for around 20 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A where both Tim and Kathy will answer your questions. We do have a buffer after the 1 p.m. end time, so if you've got any burning questions or you want to hang around, please feel free to do so. And about 48 to 72 hours after we finish this session, we'll send out an email that has a recording of the video, links to the slides, as well as ways that you can reconnect with Tim or Kathy or figure out how you can come visit us in the digital studio. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Tim, to get us going.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you everybody for joining today. So for the next 20 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about, with some practical examples of kind of the IN experience, and that I is really around innovation. So how do you think about innovation in its relationship to experience? And so we'll look at some things from kind of bird's eye view, a little bit of the 30,000 foot view, and then actually going much closer to ground level with some, I think some practical kind of tips and takeaways to help you to kind of keep that orientation to innovation and experience. This is a sentiment that is not entirely fair, but 85% of Americans believe government should match or exceed commercial service levels. So the reality is people, all of us, have expectations that are set by the best experiences that we experience in any part of our lives. So we all have experiences, whether it's around kind of how we order food or order products or get feedback on experiences that we have. All of these expectations kind of set the bar for experiences broadly, and we call that liquid expectations, this notion of having kind of in-kind expectations kind of within a specific type of experience, but also looking at adjacent spaces that really set the bar for broad expectations. Again, we call this liquid expectations, and I think we can ask ourselves, what does that mean for America's Innovation Agency? What does that mean for USPTO? So in a world, in order to keep up with the world of change, we think that federal agencies, much like their commercial counterparts, need to cultivate a culture that enables innovation. And the three main topics that we wanted to go through today are around how you put humans at the center of the process, the center of how you articulate experiences, how do you articulate your brand and purpose, which is kind of an interesting space to think about relative to federal, and then how do you create a culture of experimentation. So starting with kind of humans at the center, the reality is that technology changes incredibly quickly, but people, ultimately don't. So unlike technology, people do not change overnight. They've got, we're all born with amazing capabilities, but those capabilities don't change. That the basics kind of remain constant as far as our expectations and our needs. And our position is that human-centered design is an amazing way to reimagine experiences and to unlock the potential of what it can bring for us. So when we think about kind of bottlenecks for great progress, technology is less of a bottleneck now, and now it's more around kind of understanding these frequently changing consumer expectations. So this is why we have and why it's been adopted broadly as kind of an approach to using things like design thinking, using things like human-centered design as a way to provide a type of orientation to what matters when we're thinking about experiences. And so when you put humans at the center of the process, there are a few things that we keep in mind. So how do you understanding kind of latent anxieties and need states is really a great key, and a great point of orientation to think about the creation of new experiences and opportunities. And when you have kind of new ways of reaching people and looking at the broader ecosystem, that surrounds USPTO and your partners, it gives you a great chance to have a solid foundation. So just a few things that I would touch on relative to kind of keeping humans at the center is we'll talk a lot about empathy. So starting with empathy, understanding what is driving, what people are thinking, feeling, seeing, doing, and then articulating that in the process around design and innovation. So you can understand the unstated opportunities. And a lot of times in the discovery process, as you understand, where opportunities lie, the idea of finding insights that are not just articulated as needs, but they're observed as needs. So that's why we tend to, put more of a downbeat on observational research to supplement kind of the stakeholdering that goes along with the discovery process. I think a commitment to radical collaboration is another important kind of aspect to it. This notion of the nature of the problems that we typically are solving for in the world, the collective we are solving for, are so incredibly woolly and so incredibly complex that a kind of a monoculture or a single type of person or a single person cannot solve it. So in many ways, from a design and innovation standpoint, we have a responsibility to create the environment for that to happen. We work with partners to basically co-create the path forward, and we use design techniques in order to get the most out of people with and allow us to move at pace and with a certain velocity. We'll talk a lot about, and I know the notion for USPTO, the notion of like a customer is can be a little bit tricky, and it doesn't relate obviously to commercial experiences, but we'll frequently talk about kind of actors and constituents. So whether we're talking about employees or we're talking about applicants, administrators, managers, and the like, we need to understand how these different pieces kind of fit together in a broader ecosystem, so that we can understand kind of the obvious experience, the thing that's happening through a point interaction, but also what's kind of living backstage, what people, process, and tools, and the actors associated with that. So another important thing to keep in mind. Identify mindsets is fourth point here is about really understanding where somebody is at a moment in time. What are their values? What are their needs? What are their decisions in context? So it's important to understand something in its next larger context. And so mindsets are a really effective way to be able to take action there. And then storytelling. We were talking before the call about some of the kind of opportunities kind of within federal that are similar to maybe some of the things that we see in the commercial space is the need for making the complex simple. So how do you make things relatable with metaphor, with frameworks, with visualizations, and then allow it to be socialized across the organization to get people on the same page. And we'll talk about that a little bit later around kind of prototyping and testing as well. So these are just some of the components of keeping humans in the center that should feel, I think, a bit familiar to the UX crew in the room, in the proverbial room. Another thing I want to talk about is, and this one might feel a little bit like a left turn down a dark alley at times, but thinking, in a federal context about brand, and increasingly what's been happening in the world of, interaction and service design is that the brand is ultimately what people feel it is. So increasingly you don't own your brand as much as you influence it. And so from a kind of our projection standpoint, increasingly there's this kind of interplay between the promise that you make, which is your brand promise, and then the proof, which is how that experience kind of plays out. And so you could argue that the way you provide feedback, the way you let somebody know what's coming next, the way you provide feedback that you've actually received a submission, that's a brand experience as much as ease of use and usability throughout a process, or kind of how you articulate a mission and vision on a website. It's really, it's about kind of evidence as you kind of move through that. So we do think that for a variety of reasons, including employee experience, which we'll get into in just a second, that brand is a good thing for federal agencies to be thinking about regularly when it comes to kind of articulating kind of your why statement and your promise, and then thinking about the initiatives that pay it off and bring it to life. And I think from an experience standpoint and a user experience standpoint, I would say that there's been this progression over the last 10 years where B2C is the kind of business to consumer experiences have always gotten, a lot of love, and people will talk about it, read about it, invest in it significantly, about being relevant to consumers and customers. And then we saw the trend to kind of B2B, business to business broadly, globally. And then what we're seeing more is kind of this B to E or B to we. We've referred to it as this kind of employee experience. So, and particularly in the context of branding, employer branding is critical to attracting and retaining talent in an increasingly competitive market. So some of the content we'll send to you afterwards is a federal brand worth working for. This was actually a report out by Accenture and AFS and our Human Capital Group, actually published this Monday. So it's looking at a variety of different components of the employee value proposition, which really does relate, at its core to kind of brand and brand mission. So at the last point on the left, research has shown that 12% of federal leaders have a clearly articulated value proposition. So that relates to kind of what you stand for, the positions that you take. And one snippet from the report on the right-hand column, particularly around kind of Gen Z and federal employment, they were asked, which employment attributes could appeal to younger workers, and mission and stability were the two biggest ones. So I would say mission and purpose and that brand proposition and brand promise are really kind of inextricably linked. So it was interesting to see that both from an external-facing brand, but also from an employee-facing brand. So we'll get to this content. There's a ton of really good stuff and very actionable content in that report as well. And actually, let me stop there since I can't see any potential yellow hands or actual hands. Any questions on anything I've gone through so far? I just want to make sure that everybody's tracking and I'm not presenting to myself here. Or keep going if not. Okay, I'll keep chugging, but Kathy, please keep me honest if there's anything in the window. And when we think about kind of desirable experiences, we think about innovation. We think there are three primary characteristics that relate to the creation of service and experience strategy that can kind of help to give you a point of orientation as you go. So around viability, is it a sustainable model? Feasibility, does it build on the strengths of your current capabilities? And then desirability, something that people really need and covet. And there's an emotional component to this. And I'll tell you from kind of firsthand experience, when we look at kind of rubrics to use and critique when we're evaluating, potential, solutions that relate to anything from strategy to product design work. It's really easy to overlook the emotional component of this, which is why we had kind of a downbeat on kind of empathy earlier, is this desirability, the emotional quotient. This is frequently the thing that makes the work that you do most memorable, most resonant, and kind of engender kind of acceptance and loyalty, and keeps people kind of leaning into experiences. So that's, I think, a significant one to keep in mind. And then the third kind of chapter of content that we wanted to take you through is really around, increasingly, particularly around strategy as well as product design, but kind of this notion of kind of experimentation. And I would say our responsibility as kind of designers and technologists ultimately is to make the implicit explicit. So when it comes to experiments, we think that there's a huge opportunity to centralize learnings, but to decentralize the experiments that you run as an organization. So we'll go, the next couple of slides will go into that a little bit more. So this notion of, we need to fail down here so we don't fail up there. And I think the notion of risk in a federal context is also, and failure in a federal context is a pretty fraught one. So it's this, this kind of feeling of, not doing your job or not getting things right, or failing citizens or what have you. But ultimately, you can find exponential returns if you do make that commitment to moving in a kind of a sure-footed but quick way. And so we'll talk a lot about, particularly around experiments, is this notion of velocity. So not just speed, not just being quick, but velocity, which is speed plus purpose. So kind of back to kind of brand purpose. So like, we're moving in this direction, and we're going to take small steps, validate those steps. So have a hypothesis, execute a test, have metrics associated with what you need to learn. It's this commitment to kind of continual learning. So this constant kind of cycling of kind of thinking and doing, testing and learning. And I think that relates every bit as much to strategy as it does, and innovation as it does into the product world. And increasingly what we've seen, and I think those of you kind of with an orientation to kind of UX, and particularly around kind of like continual improvement in an agile format around products, is this, I think gone are the days typically, with some exceptions, where you've got like a concurrent steps of discovery and research and insights, and then that's all crystallized in a nice little report, and then it moves on to be executed against. And I think it's a combination of like the world changing so quickly, expectations changing so quickly, that we need to have a lot shorter cycle. So increasingly what we're seeing is research is essentially kind of a bedrock, and then the kind of the experience that's created on top of it is kind of constantly cycling through there. So this notion of bringing human-centered design into agile formats, and particularly scaled agile, is something that I think relates very, very strongly to the notion of kind of a commitment to experiment. So just an example around kind of strategy prototyping. So just these quick cycles between prototype and test iterations. And these are, this is some recent work. Some folks on the call will recognize some of this. But the prototypes take many different forms, and they can be, I think, very physical at times. They can be extremely digital at times. And then it's kind of how do you cycle through this? So just an example, we did work in the commercial space in our Chicago studio. around kind of rethinking. Ultimately, it started off being around the gate experience, or around kind of almost the artifact around the furniture of the gate itself. So we essentially had a digital model. We built it in physical format to let people maneuver it. And now what you see on the right is where we start to get into the complement of simulations with experiments. So running 8 different variables. In this case, it wasn't around the gate experience. It was around an AI-powered intelligent assistant. But how do you manipulate these variables to see the impact on flow, traffic flow and wait time and throughput? And so there are a lot of different ways that you can kind of quickly test these hypotheses. Just a quick note before we get to our takeaways around companies that are prone to experimentation. Granted, there are things that Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, and Google are doing that aren't just around kind of a commitment to the experiments they run, but you can see this is a chart from 2017 from Optimizely around this Fortune 100 mix of kind of market cap to experimentation index of firms that are fundamentally committed to running this level of experiments that you see on the right. And so this is a great way to kind of avoid disruption, disrupt others, and future-proof yourself. So the last slide is around, I just wanted to give you some takeaways that touch on some of the key moments, kind of putting people first, building with empathy, having generative research methods, radical collaboration, benchmarking against the best experiences in other parts of your customers or constituents' lives, looking at the ecosystem, so consider the experience in the context that's the next larger context, making the complex feel simple through metaphor, models, props, stories, and then having a test and learn approach so we can avoid waterfall strategy, waterfall implementation, and the pitfalls inherent in it. So let me stop there and just see if there are any questions or discussion that we want to kind of prompt.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. If you can stop presentation mode, we'll welcome people to come on camera so that we can get into that amazing view, and we'll open it up for questions from folks on the line. As I said, we have time after this, but if someone's got to drop off and you have a question, please feel free to come off video and ask away. And so I usually have a little hip pocket question, so I'll do that to this to get us going. So I know on the line, I noticed there's a lot of people from the UX UI space that's on the line from USPTO. So I know you talked a bit about strategy prototyping. How would you kind of tie that into, more of that UX UI design space? Like, what's a way that you connect what you've talked to that space versus just the bigger, broader experience?
I think from a UX UI standpoint, I think a lot of that is around kind of the point of orientation. So how do we give people a sense for what could be coming? So a lot of times that relates to kind of a North Star. So what is a thing that is not just in this cycle or this this sprint, but it's a general kind of point of orientation that we know if we're not taking a straight path to it, at least we're kind of zigging and zagging to it. If you've read Ed Catzel's from Pixar, his book on Creativity Inc., it's a great kind of way to say, like, let the story be the story, but at least as you kind of create the scaffolding for it, for the Pixar stories in this case, they've got a real sense for where it's going, and so they can kind of take the twists and turns and know that they're generally going in the right direction. I think the same thing is true with product strategy and product creation. Different point of orientation, but I think that's one way. And then I think also just working at really low fidelity really quickly so that you can kind of test and learn. And I think if you find yourselves where you're talking about solutions, I would just pause and then just articulate, kind of make the implicit explicit through a comp, through a prototype, through a wireframe, what have you. But just kind of if you find yourself in a position where you're kind of you may be perpetuating ambiguity, then that's a place to just stop make something and learn. So it's kind of this commitment to making to think is another way to think about prototyping in a product scenario.
Thanks, Tim. Do we have any other questions from folks on the line or other comments? All right, I have another one to take us through the end, Tim. So this is, what we found in a lot of these sessions is that we hear, questions around what are the typical challenges that you hear and address for federal clients. So, if there was some takeaway that you had that you wanted to distill for federal clients to consider or think about with customer experiences, or a foot stomp, because I know you kind of touched on it in the beginning, what would that be as we depart for today's session?
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to the human orientation and just going beyond kind of what you think people might expect or what you think people might want, and actually, go out into the field. And that could be an employee, or that could be a customer, or that could be, an applicant, or somebody, looking to exploring a patent. And I think it's doing a little bit of that due diligence to kind of understand their mindset, because that will, you'll find that fundamentally changes kind of how you think about work. And I've seen this, happen in cases where there's this kind of abstract notion of what, good is, but there's nothing like living in somebody else's skin or being next to them as they're encountering things to give you that empathy to know that, who you're acting on behalf of. So that's a very kind of a visceral way, just kind of being able to kind of walk that path with your customers and your users.
Sure. And Kathy, having come from government, anything for you to add for that federal perspective and just kind of what we think about with, designing in digital government that you want to share with the group?
Yeah, sure. And I think particularly for PTO, where you have such a complex process that is governed by very strict kind of requirements and needs, I think it's very easy to get kind of caught up in doing things the way they've always been done without really understanding what are some of the pain points for the people with whom you're interacting. And I know Chelsea and her team have done a lot of good work to try to really understand how do you unpack some of the complexities of particularly the patent process, to really understand where there are opportunities to streamline that process based on what's most important to your customers, your applicants. I think one of the most common things that we see across government that I suspect applies there equally well is that often we get bogged down in trying to find solutions to really complex, hairy problems, when there are simple things that are in fact more important to people, like for specifically having transparency in process so they know where they are in a very complex process. And instead of calling and using up your valuable time, they can themselves see where they are in the process, or be able to see that there's something missing that they need to provide. So sort of relying on feedback directly from the people with whom you're interacting at the point of transaction can help reveal what some of those opportunities are that may be less obvious, but can in fact make a big difference.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thank you both for your time. Thanks to our participants from USPTO and our colleagues across the board for coming today. We appreciate you spending time with us on the Summer Breakthrough. We'll send a follow-up email with the slides, recording, and ways to get in touch with us. So thanks again for your time, and we'll see you around. The next Summer Breakthrough series will be in 2 weeks on September 2nd, and we'll be talking about trust as critical infrastructure. So invite your colleagues, and we'll see you next time. Bye.